Rebecca Hayes thought she was humiliating another poor woman that morning, but before the sun set over downtown Chicago, she would realize she had just thrown the owner's wife out of his own bank. The towering glass walls of Dominion Trust reflected the pale winter sunlight across the crowded financial district, while luxury sedans lined the curb outside the marble entrance. Inside, polished floors gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers, and every employee moved with the rehearsed precision expected from one of the most prestigious banks in Illinois. Men in tailored suits discussed investment portfolios in low, confident voices, while women wearing designer heels carried leather folders worth more than some people's monthly rent. It was the kind of place where appearance mattered before words were ever spoken. And that was exactly why Evelyn Carter immediately stood out. At 36, Evelyn carried herself with quiet grace, but nothing about her appearance screamed wealth. Her cream-colored sweater looked soft from years of wear. Her jeans were simple, and her brown leather purse had slightly faded edges that suggested practicality instead of luxury. Her blonde hair rested loosely over one shoulder, and her flat shoes made almost no sound against the marble floor as she stepped inside the bank, holding a sealed envelope carefully against her chest. Several employees glanced at her for barely a second before dismissing her completely. One teller quickly shifted attention toward a sharply dressed businessman who had entered behind her. Another employee subtly smirked before whispering something to a coworker near the reception desk. Evelyn noticed every look. She always did. But she had learned long ago that dignity did not require an audience. At the center of the lobby stood Rebecca Hayes, the branch manager, perfectly composed in a fitted navy blazer with a silver Dominion Trust pin fastened near her collarbone. Rebecca prided herself on maintaining what she called standards. To her, Dominion Trust represented exclusivity, power, and status. And within seconds of seeing Evelyn standing quietly near the front desk, Rebecca had already decided she did not belong. "There. Can I help you?" Rebecca asked finally, though her tone suggested the opposite. Evelyn offered a polite smile. "Yes, thank you. I'm here to open a foundation account and make a deposit." Rebecca's eyes moved slowly over Evelyn's sweater and worn handbag before returning to her face. "Do you currently bank with Dominion Trust?" "No," Evelyn answered calmly. "But I was told the paperwork was already prepared." Rebecca extended a manicured hand, and Evelyn carefully handed over the envelope. The moment Rebecca saw the check inside, her expression changed. $2 million. For a brief second, genuine shock flickered across her face before suspicion quickly replaced it. Around them, nearby conversations softened as curiosity spread quietly through the lobby. Rebecca looked back up slowly. "Where exactly did you get this check?" Evelyn remained composed. "It's for the Carter Educational Foundation. We're funding scholarship programs for low-income students across Illinois." Rebecca gave a tight smile that never reached her eyes. "I see." But her expression made it painfully clear that she did not believe a word. And somewhere deep beneath the polished calm of Dominion Trust, the first crack in the morning had already begun to form. Rebecca lowered the check onto her desk as if touching something contaminated. Around the lobby, the soft hum of conversation had already shifted into cautious silence. Customers sitting in the leather waiting chairs pretended not to stare, but their eyes kept drifting toward Evelyn standing quietly beneath the glow of the chandelier. Rebecca folded her hands carefully. $2 million is a very serious amount of money, Miss Carter." Evelyn nodded politely. "Yes, the scholarship expansion launches next month, and we needed the account finalized before the board meeting on Friday." Rebecca tilted her head slightly. Board meeting. The way she repeated the words sounded less like curiosity and more like disbelief. Evelyn could already sense what was happening. She had experienced versions of this moment before in upscale restaurants, luxury stores, and private events where wealth was measured by watches and handbags instead of character. But she had promised herself years ago that she would never allow bitterness to harden her heart. "If there is additional paperwork needed, I would be happy to provide it," Evelyn said gently. Rebecca glanced again at the check, then at Evelyn's faded purse. "And this foundation belongs to you. I founded it 6 years ago." Rebecca gave a slow smile that felt colder than the Chicago wind outside. "That is impressive." But her tone carried none of the warmth the word should have held. Instead, she pressed a button beneath her desk. Seconds later, a younger employee named Melissa approached cautiously. Could you verify this routing information for me? Rebecca asked loudly enough for nearby customers to hear. Melissa took the check carefully, and the moment her eyes widened at the amount, several people nearby began openly watching. A man in a charcoal suit lowered his newspaper. An older woman paused halfway through signing paperwork at another desk. The room had started listening. Melissa looked uncertain. Everything appears legitimate. Rebecca's expression tightened almost invisibly. Run it again. Melissa obeyed without argument while Rebecca leaned back in her chair and studied Evelyn more openly now. You understand, Rebecca said. We have strict fraud protocols here at Dominion Trust. Evelyn nodded calmly. Of course. People attempt financial scams every day. The sentence hung deliberately in the air. A few customers exchanged awkward glances. Melissa returned quietly a moment later. The account connected to the check is valid. Rebecca barely looked at her. That does not mean the transaction itself is. Evelyn could feel the atmosphere changing around her now. The tension had become visible, moving through the marble lobby like invisible smoke. She noticed one employee whispering near the reception desk, while another discreetly glanced toward security near the entrance. Rebecca folded the check neatly and slid it back across the desk. I am afraid we cannot process this transaction right now. Evelyn blinked softly. May I ask why? Rebecca's voice sharpened just slightly. Because situations like this require discretion, and, frankly, Ms. Carter, there are inconsistencies that concern me. What inconsistencies? Rebecca's eyes drifted over Evelyn once more. Sweater, jeans, worn shoes, ordinary. People handling multimillion-dollar charitable deposits generally present themselves differently. The words landed softly, but the humiliation behind them echoed loudly through the silent lobby. Evelyn felt heat rise in her cheeks as several customers looked away uncomfortably. Melissa shifted beside the desk, clearly disturbed by what was happening, but Rebecca continued smoothly. Dominion Trust serves a very exclusive clientele. We have a responsibility to maintain certain standards. Evelyn stared at her quietly for several seconds. Then she asked the question Rebecca never expected. Standards of banking, Evelyn said softly, or standards of appearance? And for the first time that morning, Rebecca Hayes had no immediate answer. The question lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Standards of banking or standards of appearance? For a moment, even the distant clicking of keyboards seemed to fade beneath the heavy silence spreading across the lobby. Rebecca Hayes straightened slowly in her chair, her polished smile tightening at the edges. She was not accustomed to being challenged, especially not by someone she had already decided was beneath her. Dominion Trust values professionalism, Rebecca replied carefully. And professionalism includes credibility. Evelyn held her gaze without anger. I brought verified documents, valid identification, and a certified check. Rebecca folded her arms. That does not change the fact that this situation raises concerns. Nearby customers pretended to focus on their own business, but no one was truly listening to anything else anymore. A young teller paused in the middle of counting cash. Two men near the investment offices quietly stopped their conversation. The room could feel something building. Rebecca turned toward Melissa again. Contact corporate verification. Melissa hesitated briefly. Corporate already cleared the foundation this morning. Rebecca's expression darkened slightly. Then contact security. The words landed like cold steel across the marble floor. Evelyn blinked softly, almost more disappointed than shocked. Melissa looked visibly uncomfortable now. Rebecca, I really do not think that is necessary. I did not ask for your opinion, Rebecca snapped quietly. The tension in the lobby tightened instantly. Evelyn could feel eyes moving toward her from every direction now. Some curious, some judgmental, some sympathetic, but all watching. Two security guards near the entrance exchanged uncertain glances before beginning to walk toward the desk. Their shoes echoed softly against the marble as the entire bank grew unnaturally still. Rebecca lowered her voice slightly, though everyone could still hear every word. Miss Carter, I think it would be best if you left voluntarily before this situation becomes embarrassing. Evelyn stared at her calmly. Embarrassing for who? Rebecca's jaw tightened. She had spent years climbing through the rigid hierarchy of Dominion Trust, memorizing the tastes of wealthy clients, studying expensive brands, learning exactly how powerful people spoke and dressed. In her world, appearances were not superficial. They were currency, and Evelyn Carter violated every rule she believed separated important people from ordinary ones. Rebecca glanced toward the security guards now, standing only a few feet away. This institution cannot simply process multi-million-dollar transactions for anyone who walks through the door. Evelyn slowly looked around the magnificent lobby. Crystal chandeliers, marble columns, gold lettering shining behind the reception desk. Then she quietly asked, "Do you know how many children this check could help?" Rebecca did not answer. "Do you know how many scholarships this foundation has already funded?" Still silence. Or does none of that matter once someone walks in wearing the wrong sweater? A hush fell over the room. One of the guards shifted awkwardly beside the desk, clearly uncomfortable with the direction this had taken. Even Melissa looked close to speaking again before stopping herself. Rebecca suddenly stood. "That is enough." Her voice echoed sharply across the lobby. Several customers flinched. "You are disrupting business operations, and I am officially asking you to leave Dominion Trust immediately." Evelyn looked at her for a long moment. There was no anger in her eyes. No panic, only quiet sadness, the kind that comes from recognizing how easily people reveal themselves when they think power is on their side. Slowly, Evelyn reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. Rebecca folded her arms confidently, certain she had already won. But the moment Evelyn calmly unlocked the screen and raised the phone to her ear, something subtle shifted in the atmosphere. Because the woman Rebecca thought she had humiliated was not trembling. She was not begging. And she was definitely not defeated. Evelyn lifted the phone calmly to her ear while the entire lobby watched in silence. Rebecca Hayes remained standing behind her desk with her arms folded tightly, convinced the woman in front of her was bluffing. People who truly belonged inside Dominion Trust did not look like Evelyn Carter. At least that was what Rebecca had always believed. The security guard stopped only a few feet away, uncertain whether they were witnessing fraud or something far more dangerous to the bank's polished reputation. Evelyn finally spoke softly into the phone. "Daniel." Her voice remained steady despite dozens of eyes fixed on her. "I am sorry to interrupt your meeting, but there seems to be a problem at the bank." A pause followed. Rebecca glanced impatiently toward the guards. "Miss Carter, this conversation can happen outside." Evelyn barely looked at her. "Yes," she continued quietly into the phone. "At the downtown branch." Another pause. Then the faintest smile touched Evelyn's face. "Thank you." She lowered the phone gently and slipped it back into her purse. Rebecca gave a short, humorless laugh. "Calling someone will not change policy." Evelyn simply nodded. "You are probably right." The answer unsettled Rebecca more than anger would have, because there was no desperation in Evelyn's voice. No fear, only patience. And patient people were difficult to control. One of the guards finally cleared his throat awkwardly. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "maybe it would be best if we all took a moment." Rebecca turned sharply toward him. "She has already been asked to leave." The guard hesitated. "She has not caused any disturbance." Rebecca's expression hardened instantly. "I decide what disrupts this bank." Across the lobby, whispers spread more openly now. A young man near the investment offices quietly muttered, "This is getting ugly." An older customer shook his head while pretending to review paperwork. Even Melissa looked deeply uncomfortable standing beside Rebecca's desk. But Rebecca could not stop now. Pride had already pushed her too far. "Ms. Carter," Rebecca said coldly, "Dominion Trust has built its reputation serving serious clients. We cannot simply entertain every dramatic story involving charity foundations and oversized checks." Evelyn slowly looked up at her. "Do you hear yourself?" Rebecca opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, movement outside the towering glass windows suddenly caught everyone's attention. A black Escalade turned sharply toward the curb in front of the bank entrance. Then another followed behind it. The soft murmur inside the lobby immediately faded into complete silence. Several employees instinctively straightened their posture. One teller nearly dropped a stack of deposit slips. Rebecca frowned toward the entrance, confused by the sudden shift in atmosphere. The front doors opened automatically, and cold winter air swept briefly across the marble floor as three men in dark suits entered first. Their presence alone changed the energy in the room. Calm, controlled, important. Then the fourth figure stepped through the doorway. Tall, confident, dressed in a charcoal overcoat over a perfectly tailored navy suit. Daniel Carter moved through the lobby with the quiet authority of someone who never needed to announce power, because everyone around him already felt it. Conversations died instantly. Employees who had ignored Evelyn moments earlier suddenly looked terrified. Rebecca stared at the man approaching from across the marble floor and felt her stomach tighten. Because she recognized him immediately. Everyone at Dominion Trust did. Daniel Carter was not just wealthy. He was the owner whose name sat quietly above every executive boardroom in the company. And at that exact moment, Rebecca Hayes realized the woman she had just humiliated was looking directly at him with unmistakable familiarity. The entire lobby froze as Daniel Carter crossed the marble floor with measured steps, his polished shoes echoing through the silence like a countdown nobody could stop. Employees who had been whispering moments earlier suddenly lowered their eyes. The security guards instinctively stepped backward. Even the customers sitting near the investment offices straightened in their seats as recognition swept across the room. Daniel Carter was not simply another wealthy executive. He was the man whose decisions shaped careers inside Dominion Trust. The man featured in financial magazines beside politicians and billion-dollar acquisitions. And at that moment, his full attention was fixed on Evelyn. Rebecca Hayes felt the color slowly drain from her face as Daniel approached the desk without looking at anyone else. Evelyn stood calmly where she was, her sweater soft beneath the harsh white lobby lights, looking entirely out of place beside the luxury surrounding her. Yet somehow, Daniel walked toward her as if she were the only person in the building who mattered. He stopped directly in front of her. His expression softened instantly. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. Evelyn gave a small nod. "I am fine." Daniel studied her face for another second, as if confirming it for himself. Then his eyes slowly moved toward Rebecca. The temperature in the room seemed to drop all at once. Rebecca forced a nervous smile onto her face. "Mr. Carter, I can explain." Daniel did not answer immediately. That silence was worse. He looked at the check still sitting on the desk, then at the security guards standing nearby, then finally back at Rebecca. "Please do," he said calmly. Rebecca swallowed hard. "We were simply following security procedures regarding an unusual transaction." Daniel glanced toward Melissa. "Was the transaction verified?" Melissa hesitated only briefly. "Yes, sir. Corporate verification cleared it before Ms. Carter arrived." Rebecca quickly interrupted. "But there were concerns regarding legitimacy and client presentation." The moment the words left her mouth, several employees visibly cringed. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. Client presentation. Rebecca tried to recover. Dominion Trust maintains a very high standard environment for our clientele, and I believe caution was appropriate under the circumstances. Daniel looked at Evelyn again. What exactly were the circumstances? The room went silent. Rebecca opened her mouth carefully now, fully aware that every sentence could destroy her career. Ms. Carter entered carrying a $2 million check while dressed very casually, and when questions were asked, she became confrontational. Evelyn said nothing. She did not need to. Daniel's expression changed almost imperceptibly, but everyone nearby felt it. "Confrontational," he repeated quietly. Rebecca nodded too quickly. "Yes, sir." Daniel turned slowly toward one of the guards. "Did my wife threaten anyone?" The guard immediately shook his head. "No, sir." Daniel looked toward Melissa next. "Did she raise her voice?" "No, sir." "Did she disrupt this bank in any way?" Melissa lowered her eyes briefly. "No, sir." Daniel turned back toward Rebecca. The silence became unbearable now. "Then what exactly made her suspicious to you?" Rebecca stood completely still. Her polished confidence had evaporated beneath the weight of a question she could not answer honestly without exposing herself completely. Daniel took one slow step closer to the desk. "Was it the sweater?" he asked softly. Nobody moved. "The shoes." Rebecca's breathing became shallow. "Or was it simply because the woman standing in front of you did not look wealthy enough for your respect?" A hush fell across the marble lobby so deep that even the distant ringing phones sounded intrusive. Daniel rested one hand lightly against the desk beside the untouched check. "You humiliated the woman who built the scholarship foundation this bank proudly advertises in its annual reports." Rebecca's lips parted slightly in shock. Around the room, realization spread rapidly through the employees. The Carter Educational Foundation, the same charity featured across Dominion Trust marketing campaigns for years. The same foundation praised publicly by executives during shareholder meetings. And the woman they had just watched being escorted toward the door was the founder, standing quietly in front of them all along. Rebecca Hayes felt every pair of eyes in the lobby shift toward her as the truth settled over Dominion Trust like a storm cloud. Just minutes earlier, she had stood confidently behind her polished desk, convinced she was protecting the bank's image from someone she considered unworthy. Now the same marble lobby that once made her feel powerful suddenly felt painfully exposed. Daniel Carter remained calm, but somehow that made the moment even worse. He was not shouting. He was not humiliating her publicly the way she had humiliated Evelyn. His restraint carried far more weight than anger ever could. Rebecca tried to steady herself. "Mr. Carter, I did not realize who she was." Daniel looked at her quietly. "That is exactly the problem." Silence swallowed the room again. Rebecca's throat tightened. If you had known she was connected to me," Daniel interrupted softly, "you would have treated her differently." Rebecca could not answer, because everyone in the lobby already knew he was right. Daniel slowly picked up the untouched check from the desk and looked down at it for a moment. "Do you know how many first-generation college students this foundation has helped?" Rebecca lowered her eyes. "No, sir. Over 12,000. His voice remained steady. "Most of them came from neighborhoods banks ignored because there was no profit in helping them." Evelyn stood quietly beside him, her expression unchanged. She had spent years building the Carter Educational Foundation without asking for recognition. She visited schools personally. She sat with struggling families. She answered scholarship emails herself late at night, while most people assumed wealthy lives were built on comfort alone. Yet standing inside one of the most powerful banks in Chicago, none of that had mattered once Rebecca saw an old sweater and faded shoes. Daniel looked around the lobby slowly. This institution was supposed to stand for trust. His eyes settled briefly on the employees watching in silence, not judgment. Several staff members lowered their heads immediately. Melissa looked visibly emotional now, disturbed not only by Rebecca's behavior, but by how quickly everyone else had remained silent while it happened. One older customer near the waiting area quietly removed his glasses and shook his head. Another customer slowly put away the phone she had been using to record. The atmosphere had completely changed. Embarrassment now hung over the lobby heavier than authority ever had. Rebecca finally spoke again, though her voice sounded smaller now. "I was trying to protect the bank." Daniel studied her carefully. "No, you were trying to protect your idea of who deserves respect." The words hit harder than shouting ever could. Rebecca blinked rapidly, her carefully polished composure beginning to crack beneath the unbearable weight of public truth. Daniel turned toward one of the senior executives who had quietly entered behind him moments earlier. "Suspend all customer interactions at this branch for the next hour," he said calmly. "I want a full internal review completed by tonight." The executive nodded immediately. "Yes, sir." Rebecca's face turned pale. "Mr. Carter, please." But Daniel did not look angry. Somehow that made the consequences feel even more final. "People reveal their character when they believe someone has nothing to offer them," he said quietly. "And today you revealed yours." The lobby remained completely silent as Rebecca stood frozen behind her desk, surrounded by marble walls, polished gold lettering, and the shattered remains of the authority she once thought made her important. Beside Daniel, Evelyn finally spoke softly for the first time since he arrived. "Daniel." He turned toward her immediately, his expression softening again. Evelyn glanced briefly at Rebecca before lowering her eyes slightly. "I do not want revenge." And in that moment, the room learned something far more powerful than wealth. Evelyn's quiet words settled over the lobby with a force that no raised voice could have matched. "I do not want revenge." For several seconds, nobody moved. Rebecca Hayes stood behind her desk staring at Evelyn, as if she could not understand how someone who had just been publicly humiliated could still speak with kindness. Daniel Carter looked at his wife carefully, and something softened in his expression again. He had spent years watching Evelyn choose compassion in moments where bitterness would have been easier. That was the difference between them and people like Rebecca. Wealth had never been the foundation of Evelyn's dignity. Character was. Daniel slowly nodded. "You always say that," he said quietly. Evelyn gave the faintest smile. "Because humiliation does not become justice simply because the roles are reversed." The words lingered heavily through the marble lobby. Several employees lowered their eyes in visible shame. Melissa pressed her lips together tightly, fighting emotion she could no longer hide. Even some of the customers watching nearby looked deeply uncomfortable now, as if they had suddenly realized how easily ordinary people become silent spectators when someone vulnerable is being judged. Rebecca swallowed hard. Her voice came out smaller than before. Mrs. Carter, but the apology stalled halfway. Perhaps because she finally understood that the problem was bigger than one cruel moment. It was years of believing appearance determined value. Years of measuring human worth through polished shoes, tailored suits, and social status. Evelyn stepped slightly closer to the desk, her voice calm and almost gentle. Do you know why I dress like this? Rebecca shook her head faintly. Because when I started the foundation, I spent every dollar I had helping students instead of impressing strangers. Silence. I visited shelters where children shared one textbook between 4 people. I met teenagers working night shifts just to keep their families afloat. I watched students with extraordinary talent lose scholarships because nobody important thought they looked successful enough. Rebecca's eyes slowly filled with regret. Evelyn glanced around the lobby. So eventually, I stopped caring about appearances too. One older man seated near the waiting area quietly removed his glasses again, visibly affected by her words. Nearby, a young teller discreetly wiped at her eyes before quickly looking down at her desk. Daniel looked around the room carefully. This bank funds community campaigns every year about inclusion, opportunity, and dignity, he said calmly. But slogans mean nothing if people inside these walls cannot recognize humanity standing directly in front of them. Nobody disagreed. Because nobody could. Rebecca finally lowered her head completely. I was wrong. The admission barely rose above a whisper. Daniel studied her silently for a long moment. Then he looked toward the executive standing nearby. Rebecca Hayes will remain suspended pending review. Rebecca closed her eyes briefly as the reality settled over her. But before fear could fully consume the room again, Evelyn quietly spoke. And after the review, she said softly, I hope she is given the opportunity to learn from this instead of simply being destroyed by it. Rebecca looked up in genuine shock. So did everyone else. Daniel's expression shifted with quiet admiration. Even after everything, Evelyn still refused to let cruelty define the ending. The room fell silent once more, but this silence felt different now. Less tense, more reflective, like the entire building had been forced to confront something uncomfortable about itself. Outside, snow had begun falling softly over downtown Chicago, covering the busy streets in white, while inside Dominion Trust, the polished marble floors reflected something far rarer than wealth or power. They reflected humility. And for the first time that morning, Rebecca Hayes understood that the most important person in the room had been the woman she almost threw out the door. Snow continued drifting softly outside the towering glass windows of Dominion Trust, while the atmosphere inside the lobby remained heavy with reflection. Nobody seemed eager to return to normal conversation. The usual rhythm of ringing phones, hurried footsteps, and polished customer greetings had faded into something quieter now, something more human. Rebecca Hayes stood motionless behind her desk, still trying to process the fact that the woman she had judged so quickly had offered her mercy instead of humiliation. That was the part she could not understand the most. In Rebecca's world, power was usually cruel when challenged. Important people protected their pride. They punished weakness. But Evelyn Carter had done the opposite. Daniel glanced toward the executive team gathered near the entrance. Clear the lobby for 10 minutes, he said calmly. Customers will be assisted shortly. The employees moved immediately, guiding people respectfully toward the waiting area, while whispers quietly spread through the branch. Yet even as the crowd shifted, nobody looked away from Evelyn for long. Something about her presence had changed the energy inside the building itself. Melissa approached slowly, holding the original account documents with both hands. Mrs. Carter, she said nervously, everything is prepared whenever you are ready. Evelyn smiled gently. Thank you. Melissa hesitated before speaking again. I just want to say, I am sorry for not speaking up sooner. Evelyn's expression softened. You looked uncomfortable. Melissa lowered her eyes. That is not the same as doing the right thing. The honesty in her voice made Daniel glance at her with quiet approval. Evelyn gently accepted the folder from her hands. Standing up becomes easier once you decide what matters more, she said softly. Comfort or character? Melissa nodded slowly, visibly emotional. Nearby, several employees pretended to organize paperwork while listening carefully to every word. Rebecca finally stepped out from behind her desk. Her confident posture was gone now. Without the sharp tone, the polished smile, and the authority she once leaned on, she suddenly looked much more ordinary, more fragile. She stopped a few feet from Evelyn. Mrs. Carter, she said quietly, I judged you before you even spoke. Evelyn looked at her calmly, but said nothing. Rebecca swallowed hard. I built my career believing appearance reflected discipline, success, and trustworthiness. She glanced around the marble lobby. But today I realized I stopped seeing people somewhere along the way. Silence settled gently between them. Daniel watched carefully, but allowed Evelyn to respond in her own time. Finally, Evelyn spoke. Most people do not become cruel all at once. Rebecca looked up slowly. It happens gradually, one assumption at a time. The words hit Rebecca harder than any punishment Daniel could have ordered, because deep down, she knew they were true. Years inside elite financial circles had taught her how to recognize luxury brands faster than kindness. She had learned how to impress wealthy clients while slowly forgetting how to treat ordinary people with dignity. Daniel stepped beside Evelyn again. Dominion Trust will be implementing mandatory ethics and customer respect training across every branch, he said calmly. Several executives nearby immediately nodded and began taking notes. Rebecca looked stunned. Daniel's voice remained steady. This bank will not measure value by clothing, status, or appearances again. One older customer near the waiting area quietly began clapping. The sound startled the room at first. Then another customer joined. Soon, soft applause spread carefully through the lobby, not for power or wealth, but for something far rarer. Humanity. Rebecca lowered her head again, overwhelmed with shame and gratitude all at once. And as the applause echoed softly beneath the crystal chandeliers, Evelyn Carter stood quietly in her faded sweater beside the most powerful man in the building, proving without saying another word that true dignity never needed to announce itself. An hour later, the atmosphere inside Dominion Trust had completely transformed. The marble lobby that once felt cold and intimidating now carried a strange, quiet warmth beneath the glow of the chandeliers. Employees moved differently, softer, more aware. Conversations were calmer. Smiles looked more genuine. It was as if the entire building had been forced to pause long enough to remember something important that had been buried beneath years of polished appearances and corporate ambition. Evelyn sat at a private desk near the executive offices, calmly reviewing the finalized scholarship account documents while snow continued falling outside the massive glass windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Daniel sat beside her, listening as she discussed plans for expanding literacy programs into underserved neighborhoods across Illinois. Even after everything that had happened, her focus remained exactly where it had always been, helping others. Melissa approached carefully with 2 cups of coffee balanced on a tray. I remembered you asked for cinnamon, she said nervously. Evelyn smiled warmly. Thank you. Melissa hesitated before adding quietly, my mother raised me alone. Scholarships like yours helped me finish college. Evelyn looked up gently. Then you understand why this work matters. Melissa nodded with emotion in her eyes before quietly stepping away. Across the lobby, Rebecca Hayes stood near the large front windows watching snowflakes drift across the Chicago streets. Her suspension paperwork sat inside a thin folder beside her, but she barely looked at it. For the first time in years, she was not thinking about promotions, appearances, or wealthy clients. She was thinking about the people she had overlooked. The people she had silently judged while convincing herself she was simply maintaining standards. Daniel eventually walked toward her, his expression calm but unreadable. Rebecca straightened immediately. Mr. Carter. Daniel glanced toward the busy city outside before speaking. Do you know why Evelyn insisted your review include retraining instead of termination? Rebecca shook her head slowly. Because she believes shame only matters if it changes you afterward. Rebecca looked down, visibly overwhelmed. Daniel's voice remained steady. My wife grew up sharing a 2-bedroom apartment with 5 family members. She worked night shifts during college. The reason she dresses simply is because she remembers what it feels like to walk into rooms where people assume you are less important before you even speak. Rebecca felt her throat tighten painfully. Daniel looked back toward Evelyn across the lobby. Success did not make her forget people. It made her notice them more. Silence settled between them. Finally, Rebecca spoke quietly. I spent years trying to impress powerful people. Daniel nodded faintly. And somewhere along the way, you forgot that dignity is not something reserved for the wealthy. Rebecca closed her eyes briefly as the truth landed fully this time. Not defensive, not angry, just honest. Nearby, employees continued assisting customers with unusual care now, speaking more patiently, listening more closely. Something had shifted permanently inside Dominion Trust that morning. Not because the owner arrived, but because one quiet woman refused to let humiliation turn her cruel. Evelyn finished signing the final documents and stood beside Daniel once more. Together they walked slowly toward the entrance while employees respectfully stepped aside. Rebecca watched them reach the marble doors before finally finding the courage to speak one last time. Mrs. Carter. Evelyn turned gently. Rebecca swallowed hard. Thank you for seeing a better person in me than the one standing at that desk this morning. Evelyn held her gaze for a moment before giving the faintest smile. The world changes when people decide to learn instead of defend their pride. Then she stepped outside beside her husband into the softly falling snow. And as the doors of Dominion Trust closed quietly behind them, the people left inside understood something they would never forget. Wealth may open doors, but character is what people remember long after you walk through them.